Sometimes I read comments from people who seem quite panicked and worried, and they've found videos about autism. They start to think maybe this could make sense, maybe this could just, explain my entire life and existence. That's scary. And what does it mean if I do have the tism / am autistic? You might find yourself connecting with someone on the complete other side of the world, and maybe you thought either it was only you who had these particular struggles or weird sensory things or whatever, or you thought that everyone had them, and it's news to you that it's not everyone. It's autistic, neurodivergent people who experience these things. So you might be autistic. Now what? Now what do you do? Do you try and rush out to get an assessment? If you do, how do you do that? Is it even worth getting a diagnosis at insert whatever age you are? You've got this far in life. What do you do with the information? Okay, so I'm going to try and break down the steps that I would take if I were in your shoes, if I were back searching the YouTube rabbit hole like, what? I couldn't seriously be autistic? Really? I don't know how I ever thought I couldn't be. Just looking back now, it's so glaringly obvious. And maybe you'll get to this point too where you're like, how did I ever feel an ounce of imposter syndrome? My entire life is explained. So step one is take a deep breath. There's no need to panic. It's not a terminal illness. It's okay. It's neurodivergent. It means your brain potentially, if you are autistic or ADHD, works in a slightly different way. Not an emergency. Unless it is an emergency, unless you are concerned about your mental health, you feel like you're at a crisis point, particularly if you feel like you're in danger of hurting yourself or someone else, please call a crisis line, go to A&E, call an emergency line, get the help that you need. Autistic people can experience mental health issues too. Autism itself is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's not disorder, is what it's called in the diagnostic criteria. A lot of us prefer to say condition, but it's not a mental health condition, and you can be autistic and experience things like depression and anxiety, although autistic burnout can appear to be like depression and anxiety, so it's maybe a little bit more complicated for us. The worst thing that I can imagine happening through somebody self-diagnosing, I feel like self-diagnosis is valid, but if you actually do have another mental health condition that is treatable and you're like, oh, it's okay because I'm just autistic, but actually there are maybe other things going on there instead or as well, and then you're not getting the help that you need for those things. So if you feel like you're at a real crisis point, you really need help, go try and get an assessment as quickly as you can as well. I'll talk a little bit as I go on about how you can try and make sure that you get a medical professional who understands autism to do your assessment, because obviously not all medical professionals are created equal, and particularly a lot of autistic women or those assigned female at birth can end up misdiagnosed with other things, and sometimes those things are treated with medications, and autistic people can be a bit different with medications. Like sometimes we can have different effects than we're supposed to. Yeah, I mean, you never want to be treated for a condition that you don't have, but yes, unless it's an emergency, it's not an emergency. An autism diagnosis might get you some great accommodations in school or work, but there isn't any treatment needed. Autistic people might take medications like antidepressants, but it's not even like ADHD where there are, ADHD meds which can really, really help you. There isn't an autism med. There's not really anything that, all autistic people take or are recommended to take. There's not really a set therapy that's recommended for autism. Unfortunately, there just isn't a lot of post-diagnosis support, particularly for autistic adults. There may be some that might be a post-diagnosis support group, and like I say, you can ask for accommodations. It's not like it's meaningless and pointless, but it isn't urgent, that you get a diagnosis tomorrow. You've got time. Don't worry, your brain's not going anywhere. It's all going to be okay. A couple of years before I really went down the autism rabbit hole, I got a few little clues that I could be autistic. For some reason, I stumbled on a webpage about stimming and that being an autistic thing, and I saw hand flapping being mentioned, and it was just a huge thing that I flapped my hands constantly as a child, and I was like, oh, that's an autism thing. That's interesting. But that had always just been like a unique, creative sort of thing that I did as a child, like a little quirky thing. It was never seen as anything bad and never like pathologized in any sort of way. I looked at it and I was like, and I just knew. And if you feel like this, and there's a high chance you could be autistic as well, I knew that if I researched something, I research it hard. It becomes my whole life. I dedicate my whole existence to it. And I was in quite a bad place with having physical health problems at the time, and I just knew I did not have the capacity, and therefore I just didn't look into it anymore, and that was fine. I came back to it when I had the time, luckily, because it's quite emotionally taxing. It's kind of a grieving process. It's not necessarily easy to have to reframe your entire childhood through a new lens and comb through it for specific memories that you can use as examples. If you don't have the capacity right now, save videos and you'll watch later. Information will be here when you're ready. There's no rush. It is a lot to process, and that is okay. And it's okay if it's a roller coaster of emotions and you need to kind of like start the journey. But I will say, you're not an imposter, you're not self-indulgent or attention seeking for entertaining the possibility that you could be autistic. You're, you know, taking care of yourself and your mental health and figuring out, you know, the correct label to potentially describe yourself after a life of feeling a bit weird and like an alien. It could very well be the answer that makes everything fall into place. It can really help you to have that level of self-understanding. I think it's so valuable because you can understand your triggers, you can understand why you sometimes react the way you do to certain things, and you can mold your life to suit you because you now know who you are. Okay, step 2. So now you're ready to delve into the research. I would maybe start with quizzes. So there are some great ones you can find on Embrace Autism. The 2 that I printed out and put in my autism assessment folder when I went to get the diagnosis were the ASPE quiz and the RADSR, or the RAADSR, I don't know, which is quite a long one. Do those quizzes. If you find that you scored just in the autism side for those quizzes or just out of it, then it might be worth doing the CAT-Q after that, and it's probably worth doing it anyway. So this is a quiz that I've done twice on my channel, once on my own and once with my husband as well, who is not autistic, to kind of compare our scores, because I'm autistic and he's introverted. So I feel like that was quite an interesting video. I'll leave that linked as well. That quiz is to test if you're masking autism. So if you cover up autistic traits, if you've learnt how to kind of compensate for your autism, that was super helpful because yeah, I was scoring like just on the threshold basically on the autism quizzes, and then I did the masking quiz and got a massively high score, and I was going through it and I thought, I'm not going to get a high score, I'm not autistic, like the whole time. And then I was like, oh, okay. And then I got my mom to do it, who is similar to my husband. She probably had similar answers to him. She's just introverted, and she got a completely different score, and I was like, oh, okay, I clearly have no self-awareness whatsoever. Cool. It's just quite interesting. And these quizzes, you know, they're not diagnostic tools obviously, although some assessment centers or whatever you want to call them, some places that do the diagnosis, they will actually ask you to do those quizzes before you come in and print your results, and a lot of people do like to do them even if they're not asked and bring them in. They can just kind of get you thinking along the right lines, and then you might start to think of things in the shower, like things will pop up and you'll answer a question one way, like, no, I don't have a problem with eye contact. That was one of the things where I was like, nah, I don't really have a huge problem with eye contact. And then this memory comes back of when I was screamed at by a teacher to stand up for half an hour because my eye contact was appalling. And then I think about all the times where I've been thought of as rude, and what's that to do with eye contact? And then how when I used to make YouTube videos on a different channel, I got comments about how my eyes drift around all the time and it's distracting and annoying and can I please stop? So then I was like, okay, maybe there's something to it. And then along with the masking, it was like, oh yeah, and it all starts to come together. And you may find that it's useful to redo those quizzes in a few months' time after you've had time to think and kind of process things, particularly because some of them ask questions about, did you do this when you were younger? Like certain memories may have like come back up to the surface, because it's a lot to have to like sift through your entire life. I tend to find that I always scored pretty similarly, but you may like have remembered a few extra things on the autism side. But yeah, I think that they can be really, really helpful tools. Obviously not just any random quiz on the internet, but a lot of the ones on Embrace Autism, pretty good. As I did, you may want to ask other people in your life to kind of act as controls for you and also do the quiz. Obviously you may suspect certain family members or your partner could also be neurodivergent, or maybe they're diagnosed, but if they are, it might also be interesting to see their scores. But yeah, just ask a few other people in your life and compare what their scores are, and maybe discuss why they said what they said, and that kind of thing can kind of open your eyes, because a lot of these things we've never discussed. Have I ever had a conversation about eye contact necessarily, and how my husband feels about eye contact? Not really. Sensory stuff as well, like you kind of just assume before you know you're autistic that everybody feels these things to some extent. So now I'll like say to my husband, do you think that's really bright? Like, is that reflecting a lot for you? And he'll be like, no, it's dark if anything. And I'm like, wow, like we live in a different world. It's amazing, it's fascinating, but we've been together for a lot of years before I even started suspecting I was autistic, and we'd never had these conversations before. You may find it useful at this point to get like a notebook or start a Word document or notes on your phone, or all three, which I think is what I did, and start writing things down as you remember them, and maybe start creating like a timeline of your life you could do, or you could do subheadings of the different criteria in the DSM-5, which is a commonly used diagnostic criteria. According to the DSM-5, in order to be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. You need to have persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. So in your notebook or your Word document, you could have a heading for just social stuff that you remember. So like eye contact, stuff to do with facial expression, body language, making and maintaining friendships, any difficulties that you've had around relationships. That could be intimate relationships as well. Did you have an interest in your peers when you were younger? And then you need to have some restricted and repetitive behaviors, which is, you know, a nice sentence. I do like to think of myself as a restricted and repetitive being. It is nice to embody that on a daily basis. This includes stimming, so like little repetitive body movements that you might do. So as I said, I flapped my hand as a child. I'll still flap objects now. It would be just like biting your nails, playing with your head. Try and notice if you fidget a lot. You'll probably find the more you start thinking about this, the more like you analyze your behavior on a day-to-day basis, which is a little bit of a weird experience, but you know, it helps you to get all the information, particularly when you're in social situations, because you start to notice you're masking a lot more and it becomes like a little bit more unsettlingly conscious, and you're like, oh, there's more autism here than I may have thought there was. Then like your insistence on sameness, like how you cope with change and routines, and are there certain things that you have to do every single day? Like for example, do you have to eat the same food every day? And then interest, you could also create a list of all the interests that you can remember having through your life, and new ones from childhood might start popping up. I have a video all about special interests that might help with that one, particularly the comment section, because so many people commented their interests, so that may help reading through that. And then also a column for sensory things would be a good idea. Some autistic people are really sensitive, and some autistic people can like have hyposensory activity, so they can be less sensitive. And as well as thinking about like the 5 senses, you also got to think about balance as well, vestibular and proprioception, which is your sense of your own body in space. The DSM-5 said symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational or other important areas of current functioning. So noting down difficulties that you've had in a work situation, again as I said, maintaining relationships, how it impacts you on a day-to-day basis. Make sure you get all of that down. Step 3, you might want to grab some books about autism. So you could maybe listen to these as audiobooks if you're busy. If you're a parent, put on your noise cancelling headphones and listen while you fold the washing, or buy the books and give them a read. I would recommend Girls by Rudy Simone. I read that near the beginning of my journey, and there were some really interesting points in there, but I hadn't heard anyone else speak on really, like about how autistic people often tend to burn bridges. Obviously it's called Girls, but I think a lot of these cross over across all genders. It's not really, a super binary gender thing at all. I don't think. I'm very similar to the autistic males in my families in a lot of ways. I enjoyed it. There were a lot of discussion of the difficulties that we might have in education. I'll leave a link to all of these books that I talk about in the description below. Also Different Not Less by Chloe Hayden I've read recently. That had me tearing up. I really wish I'd read that book 10 years ago. I think that would have changed my life. Particularly if you're younger, I'd recommend this, but I'd recommend it anyway, particularly if you want to look back at childhood. She speaks about like the bullying she experienced at school. Lots of sentences that just really, really resonated and brought back a lot of memories for me. So I think that one could be helpful. Unmasking Autism by Dr. Devon Price. That's a great book with a lot of research in there as well that could be useful. Number 4, you might want to watch videos, which you could already be doing. Particularly videos of traits were super helpful for me in the beginning, and just watching as many as you can, because you won't relate to every single one, although there were some where I was like, I don't know if I really do that? I don't know. And then I'd like send it to my mom, which is maybe something that you could do as well. Send it to other people and she'd be like, yeah, you do all of these, and like come up with examples, and I'd be like, officially attacked, thank you. And that was a weird experience for me, because sometimes I'd looked at traits of things and I'd been like, could this be me? Because I feel like I was always searching my whole life, and I'd send it to my mom and she'd be like, no, that's not you. What are you talking about? Like, you're not like that at all. That doesn't fit. And then I sent this to her and she was like, yeah. But I think probably because she knows our family and the genetics and all the stuff going on, she's like, yeah, this explains everything. Cool. But you won't relate necessarily to every single point, and you might relate to them to varying extents. It's a spectrum. Not everyone is the same. That's why that Aspie quiz that I recommended in the beginning is quite cool, because it just shows how everyone is different. Everyone gets their unique kind of profile of autism at the end of it. Yeah. Obviously, I have 3 videos about traits of autism. I have videos on masking, special interests. Also, even like, my memes one and stuff, I do probably make references to like kind of specific traits. And, if you feel like you relate to any of those things, you could note them down with some examples from your life. Olivia Hobbs has a good channel, and she has a video of herself actually having a meltdown, which might be super interesting to have a look at. People just can describe meltdowns very differently. Some people don't even seem to have meltdowns. Some people describe just having autistic shutdowns. So you might want to look into that. Yosemite Sam is also great. great. Woodshed theory I like. Mom on the Spectrum I like. Autism from the Inside is great. Lots of videos about traits. And a lot of these videos may say traits in women, traits in females in the titles, traits in A5 individuals, but that doesn't mean they don't apply to pretty much everyone, as I said. Sticking with the social media, you could also join Facebook groups. There's like Autistic Women in the UK and stuff like that. You can just request to join. Sometimes they'll ask you a couple of questions. You could just say, I'm considering that I might be autistic. You can use the search bar if you don't want to post yourself. A lot of them will allow you to post anonymously if you want to ask questions and you can't find the answers in the search bar. It can really help if you're wondering about specific things. Someone's probably had the same kind of questions before you. Step 5, as I said, you can send the videos. You could maybe even recommend the books to some relatives, see if it helps to jog their memories and help them to come up with stories that maybe you don't remember or a little bit more hazy for you. If you have someone who knew you in childhood who you can trust, because childhood memories are super important, it's a neurodevelopmental condition, it will have always been there throughout your whole life. It can be helpful to ask them certain questions. So for example, did I do any strange movements as a child? Obviously I flapped my hands, it wasn't seen as strange, it was seen as like quirky and there's nothing wrong with doing it, but ask them, was there anything that people kind of thought was different or unusual about the way that I moved as a child? Did I ever repeat things that you say? Often autistic people do something called echolalia, well they'll repeat what someone says.
Where's the baby gone?
Did you have any speech delays you could ask? I would often not reply to people when they asked me questions, even though I was capable of it, but I think because I just didn't really notice that I was being spoken to, or didn't really understand that I was supposed to reciprocate speech. I didn't know that response was required.
Good girl. Say uh-oh. So, show me your Teletubby shirt on the film, Meg. Where's your Teletubby shirt? Yeah.
How did you perform in sports at school? Was that ever an issue for you? How were you with reading? A lot of autistic people can be pretty good at reading for their age. Not all autistic people will be, but some will. Did I ever get fixated on doing certain tasks? How was I if you interrupted me, if you were like, dinner is ready and I was focused on something? Did I ever get frustrated by that? Did I have any issues with food growing up? And you can also maybe have a think about were there any family members who maybe had autistic traits as well. You could ask around to see if maybe there are relatives who are no longer with you anymore, who maybe displayed some similar behaviors. It might have been a thing throughout growing up, oh, you always do that weird thing. Yeah, your uncle did that too. If you have neurodivergent parents, it might be a bit tricky because they might be oh yeah, but everybody does that, of course, that's a normal human thing. And it's actually, mom and dad, you're just both autistic. They might kind of say things like, oh, that's just a thing our family does, or we're just anxious in this family, it's just the way it is, but it could be autism. Step 6, so I mentioned my home video. Do you have any home video you could watch? My husband doesn't, just nothing was recorded. I was so lucky that we did, because I think that was super validating for me to actually see that and to see myself flapping my hands. I could remember, I knew that I did it, and I still do it as an adult. I flap objects now. I've graduated to object. It's evolved over time. I knew I did it, and everybody could remember it, but it was just different actually seeing it. And then I had this dreadful compilation of me on sports day, which I've shown several times in my videos. It's just hilarious. How did somebody not look at that and go, this child is dyspraxic, she needs help? I remember the shame I felt during it though. It was so embarrassing. There were things like repeating the phrases, which my mom just had fallen out of her brain and she didn't remember. Even if you don't have video, because obviously that's kind of luck and privilege as to whether your parents filmed things and what they decided to film. You might have photographs from when you were younger as well. They can maybe just help to jog your memory. You may see a picture of a particular day and go, oh yeah, I was super anxious that day, and you could maybe note that down. So step 7, you've got all this information ready. Maybe you got a nice folder, you're building up this Word document. You can scroll down the notes on your phone for days. You've got all this information collected about yourself. Now what do? Do you go for an official diagnosis? And if so, how? I think in the beginning it can feel super urgent to rush out and get a diagnosis as soon as possible. I think the whole thing just feels really fragile. You've got this concept that could explain your entire life and you feel like it could be ripped away from you at any moment. So the idea of having that external validation seems very, very important. I want to say if you've already done all the research described above and whatever, and you've gone that deep into it, and you're still thinking that you could be autistic, there's probably a pretty damn high chance that you are autistic. So don't invalidate yourself too much if you can help it, and you're not overstepping a boundary by considering that you could be autistic and by, trying on that label at all. So this can be quite an emotional time. You might feel a lot of grief, you might feel anxious, you might feel angry that you didn't have a diagnosis. I went into a little bit of a kind of mini depression for a few weeks where I just felt like, oh my gosh, what does this mean? What have I lost in the past by not having this diagnosis, and what on earth does this mean for my life going forwards? Because it's so much to process emotionally, I don't think there's anything wrong with waiting to get an official diagnosis if you can bear it. Just waiting 6 months or so, kind of sift through these memories, as I say, keep writing down traits, because more things will come to you as well, which will only help you when you actually do go for an assessment, if you decide to go for an assessment. As I say, do the quizzes again after some time has passed. You've maybe got a little bit more clarity about your childhood. So you may find if you leave it a few months, that sense of urgency and desperation for an official diagnosis actually goes away. And some people never want to pursue an official diagnosis. As I said, you're not going to be given a medication. They're going to say you're autistic, and then you're going to leave, and maybe there'll be a little bit of post-diagnosis support, and maybe you can go out and find a therapist who's, informed, or maybe autistic themselves, and, as I say, accommodations. As time goes on, you might, have found yourself accepted as a self-diagnosed autistic person in the community. You may feel that, knowing that community, knowing this information about yourself, connecting to other people is all that you need to carry on and live happily ever after with that information. You're autistic. You can now forgive yourself for so many things, and some people don't need anything beyond that. A diagnosis isn't going to change their life. It's worth having a think about how a diagnosis would actually affect your life, both positively and negatively. So on the negative side, life insurance. Before you go and even inquire about getting a diagnosis, if you want life insurance, you might want to take that out beforehand, because I don't know if you're going to find anyone who's going to insure you for a decent price as an autistic person. Don't know. Getting a diagnosis may affect some careers, so you might just want to look at that with the sector that you work in, depending on what country you're in. Hopefully that'll keep changing over time. It may affect emigrating to certain countries. In a lot of countries, it's not like you cannot move there. There's been a bit of a thing recently about you can't move to Australia. They'll deport you if you're autistic. It'll be harder probably. They may, initially kind of reject you for health reasons, and you may kind of have to fight back against that and kind of get them to waive those concerns and provide evidence that you're not going to be expensive for their country because you don't have too many support needs, which is a little bit gross and may put you off wanting to move there in the first place. You got to weigh that up with the positives. It's a protected disability. You can get accommodations, reasonable adjustments at work. You might want to look into what kind of things you are able to get. I think Rudy Simone has a book about, I can't remember what it's called, I'll put it in the description, but something about Asperger's in the workplace. We don't really use the word Asperger's anymore, but that's what the book's called. You'll have some way of explaining yourself as well in misunderstandings. There have been times where people just don't get me, and have been in situations where I'm in a hospital and people just didn't get me and got very confused and thought I was asking them questions for a different reason than I actually was. They thought I was questioning what they were doing, rather than me needing to know what was going on, because I'm autistic and I don't like the uncertainty. And if I could have said, I'm autistic, please will you explain exactly what you were doing to me, because I need to know, otherwise it causes me anxiety, then there wouldn't have been that misunderstanding and that kind of communication breakdown. So it can be super helpful. Obviously, even if you're self-diagnosed, you can still say that, but in a medical setting, obviously they've got access to your medical records. It may be helpful to have an official diagnosis. If you've always struggled with education, which a lot of us have, unfortunately, a diagnosis may be the difference between you going to school again and finishing a course rather than dropping out. So that is certainly a massive plus, because you can get accommodations. There may also be benefits available to you, like there's the personal independence payment in the UK, which is not means tested, so it's available to anyone. Tricky application process from what I've heard, and can be quite grueling, but that is an option available to you. And for some jobs, you can also, state that you have a disability, and they have a scheme where they'll interview disabled people automatically. So that could be helpful if you're somebody who struggles, because we know autistic people can really, really struggle in job interviews. And of course the validation, don't underestimate that validation. I felt like, yes, I'm definitely 100% autistic as I walked through the door into my assessment, but walking out, it just, I don't know, it didn't change anything, and in a way it was like overwhelming and underwhelming at the same time. I don't know how to describe it, but also really did. It really did. And I mean, I thought like family members, it wouldn't help with them, like they wouldn't understand anymore. I don't know, it did help them to see it as something real and to accept it more when it had been confirmed by a medical professional. I thought maybe, you know, family members might turn around and be like, oh, that person was just a quack, or try and validate, you know, that I just got the dodgy diagnostician on the day, but that wasn't my experience actually, which I was pleasantly surprised with. So I don't know, who would have thought it? People do actually value medical professionals' opinions. I also want to add that you are never too old. Even if, you know, you're not going to go to work, you're not planning to go back to studying or anything like that, if you just want it for your validation, you are completely entitled to that. And again, it may completely change your life for the better, and it can also help family members to maybe be more accepting than a self-diagnosis. Even though I'm sure as an autistic person you have rigorously researched it, and it's not fair that people will just imagine that you googled it once and went, I'm autistic. But you know, that is kind of unfortunately how some people will see self-diagnosis. Not people within the autistic community, hopefully. So step 8, so if you're going ahead with the diagnosis, if you're in the UK or somewhere else with universal healthcare, you can either start messaging providers privately, if you want to go privately and kind of compare pricing, you know, message all the different places that you can. I'd probably also ask how used to diagnosing adults they are, and if you're female or an AFAB individual, you could maybe ask about that, or anyone else who doesn't fit the stereotype, like, are you accustomed to diagnosing people like me? If you want to go through the NHS, like a game of chess, I don't know, you will need to make a GP appointment, and something that nobody ever wants to hear in this country because it's hard. Hopefully wherever you live it might be a little bit easier, and there might be less phone calls and being on hold for 40 minutes involved and calling at 8 a.m. even though you're trying to get your child out the door for childcare. It can feel super nerve-wracking to make that phone call because they'll often ask, you know, what are you inquiring about? Can you give me a brief description of the problem, whatever? And you've got to say, I'd like to see about an adult autism diagnosis. But the good thing is you don't have to worry about seeming awkward, because that's only going to help your case. My practice were really respectful and no one laughed in my face, which is nice. Before you actually go to that GP appointment, if possible, I'd get an idea of where you might like to be referred and do a little bit of your own research. Can you go on Facebook groups and ask about the best services available in your area? You may actually be able to also ask to be referred to services outside of your area. You might have to fight for it, and there might be like a bit of medical admin kind of involved in that, but it might be worth a try if there's somewhere really good that's, you know, within reaching distance but it's not directly in your area. The National Autistic Society says, we recommend that you tell them about local services that have experience of multidisciplinary diagnosis of autism in adults. Print out the details of diagnostic services in your area and take them with you, or get them up on your phone. If it isn't possible to refer you to a multidisciplinary team, you could be referred to an individual professional such as a psychiatrist or clinical psychologist. This professional should be experienced in diagnosing autism, as this will mean you're more likely to be accurately assessed and will avoid having to go back to your GP for a second referral. If you're going for an autism assessment, you want somebody who is up to date, who knows that women can be autistic. It's also worth knowing that in the NHS there is something called Right to Choose, which means your clinical commissioning group, which I didn't know what that was until I started trying to do medical admin on behalf of my GP surgery, who had no idea what was going on. So be prepared. You might have to kind of follow up your referral and all sorts. They may be able to actually refer you to a private service, but on the NHS. And two places that I know definitely accept Right to Choose are Axia, who are based in Chester. They're owned by a neurodivergent clinical psychologist. Have a look at their website, they're pretty cool. And also Psychiatry UK, which actually, if you do want to go privately, as far as I know, they are the cheapest, or they are one of the cheapest. They were £900 the last time I heard. And yeah, it's a bunch of psychiatrists, and it's a virtual appointment. Axia do virtual as well as in person as well. So if you prefer virtual, that might be something to look into. I personally wanted in person because I felt like they'd get a better gist of how I interact, and they'd be able to see, you know, like my full body language. That felt like a more thorough assessment to me, but that depends on you and your circumstances and how easy it is for you to travel as well. It can seem overwhelming. There can be medical admin involved in trying to get the referral to the place that you want, the place that you think is going to be best likely to understand you and your brain. Whew, take a deep breath, take it one step at a time. So now you've made your GP appointment. So in order to prepare, I would maybe kind of take those categories that I mentioned earlier from the DSM-5 and maybe note down like maximum like 3 traits that you can think of that are like your best examples for each category and bring those along with you so that you don't forget anything. I would maybe, because GPs will not, as it says in the National Autistic Society, they will not necessarily be knowledgeable about autism, perhaps pick the most stereotypical autistic traits that you can see on there. If you do have any things with eye contact or times when people have interpreted your behavior as rude when you didn't mean it to be, videos of yourself in childhood, if you have anything that's very visually obvious, like for me, I have loads of video of me flapping hands, and you could like just record the TV screen because it can be difficult to get, you know, like old tapes depending on how old the footage is of you as a child, but you could like record, you know, TV screen or whatever and then just bring that along. In the GP appointment, you may be asked to complete a short test which is on Embrace Autism. I will link it down below, called the AQ10. You can have a look at it before you go in, and I would recommend that because sometimes we can struggle with processing things, and it might be easier if you've seen the questions beforehand. Some of them might be a little bit confusing at first, and you might want to have a little bit more of a think in depth about your answer. We usually like to be quite careful with how we answer things, and a GP appointment is pretty fast paced usually, and you might not get the time to give appropriate thought to the questions and just kind of blurt out an answer. Wherever you are in the world, I would be aware of your rights. Are there any special guidelines that your GP is supposed to follow in regards to adult autism diagnosis? In England, they must follow NICE Guideline 142, which means they must consider assessment for possible autism when a person has one or more of the following: persistent difficulties in social interaction. I like difficulties a lot more than deficits. That's nice, isn't it? You're used to raising deficits on the DSM-5. Persistent difficulties in social communication, stereotypic, rigid and repetitive behaviours, resistance to change, or restrictive interests. And one or more of the following: problems in obtaining or sustaining employment or education, difficulties in initiating or sustaining social relationships, previous or current contact with mental health or learning disability services, a history of neurodevelopmental condition, including learning disabilities and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or mental disorder. And it says, for adults with possible autism who do not have a moderate or severe learning disability, consider using the Autism Spectrum Quotient 10. If a person scores a 6 or above, or autism is suspected based on clinical judgment, offer a comprehensive assessment for autism. And the NICE guidelines also have a separate section for if someone has a severe or moderate learning disability as well. Finally, if your GP does refuse, which is probably what we fear, and I see people saying it in the comments, to refer you for an assessment, then the National Autistic Society urge you to ask them why, and if you don't feel comfortable in the assessment, maybe book another appointment. You could also speak to the reception staff. The reception staff at my current practice are really, really nice and understanding, and they may actually book an appointment for a second opinion right there and then. If you say you're not happy, you could also make a complaint and say, look, I don't think they were following the NICE guidelines here. Copy and paste the quote. They should sort it out. You don't want a GP who sees you make eye contact once and then goes, you cannot be autistic. The diagnostic criteria, the DSM-5, does not say that in order to be autistic, you have to have never ever once made eye contact in your entire life. It must be impossible for you. That is not a thing. One of the things that may be present, an example of one of the ways that you might present a little bit differently socially, is abnormalities in eye contact, not complete inability. Your life doesn't stop even if you are waiting for an official diagnosis. You may actually be able to get accommodations by just saying, look, I'm waiting for an official diagnosis. There is a long wait list. I have got this referral letter from my GP. There is a chance that I could be autistic. Please, could I have some reasonable adjustments? And you may find that your employer or your school is able to offer you some help. For me, with the Open University, they did kind of insinuate that I would only be able to get kind of minimal supports without an actual diagnosis. But I don't know, with a working diagnosis, if I'd spoken to someone at student support, I think maybe they would have been able to perhaps offer me a little bit more. The long waits are annoying, but you may actually find that time beneficial. As I said, more memories might come back to you. You might feel more prepared emotionally and in terms of the evidence that you've collated to actually have your appointment. So, you know, it could be a blessing in disguise. It can be super frustrating, particularly when you need support for education, because some of these referrals, by the time you actually get there, you could already be, you know, like done with your education, which is no good. And that's why that right to choose might be worth pursuing, because it could be a little bit faster. But even with private, there can sometimes be waits. And I think there's a lot of people discovering the neurodivergent at the moment, a lot of people needing diagnosis at the moment. So there's waits all around. But I don't know, that Psychiatry UK can be quite fast, I think. But self-diagnosis is valid. The community will accept you. Either way, anyone who doesn't, don't listen to them. It's fine. You're welcome here. Absolutely welcome here. Welcome in my comment section to spill your thoughts and feelings anytime. We're here. Hopefully my content can be helpful to you and all the other wonderful people who make videos and write books. And yeah, do such good work. Thank you very much, because you all changed my life. I hope once the initial shock is over, you can now start being kinder to yourself and reframe experiences. You're not lazy, you're not broken, you're not weird. You're autistic. You may find the video where me and my husband did the CAT-Q test together and we had a conversation about kind of introversion versus autism together. That one might be useful to you. I don't know. Bye!